to provide our readers with insight into the key problems facing our country. My name is Hilary Joffe. I'm contributing editor at Business Times, and I have to admit I am a budget nerd. I have been following the South African economy and our public finances for a long time. And I have to say that I find every budget just as interesting as the one before. And so the topic of our dialogue today, Unpacking the 2021 budget, is one which I'm very excited to be hosting, and we could not hope for better people to talk us through the big issues around the budget. Not long ago, the Sunday Times ran a wonderful piece on the mostly young, talented people who lead our Treasury, people who President Cyril Ramaphosa referred to as the pride of our nation. And the people we have with us today, who I will introduce in a moment, are among those people who the president called the pride of our nation, the leaders of our Treasury. The DG himself, Dondo Mogajane, and some of his leading DDGs. They have a very tough task. Even before we went into the COVID crisis last year, South Africa's public finances were in crisis, arguably, after 10 years in which our economic prospects had kept declining, but the demands on our spending had kept increasing. The gap between the revenue the government raises in taxes and the expenditure it makes had kept widening. Our deficits had gone up, our debt had gone up, had doubled or tripled since the global financial crisis, and was reaching, even before the COVID crisis, the kinds of levels which were really starting to worry rating agencies and investors and the country itself, and prompting ratings downgrades. And already then, before the crisis, the finance minister had warned that we had to rein in spending if we were going to make our public finances more sustainable, make them more affordable for the country in the longer term. Then came COVID. People lost their jobs and their incomes. Companies went bust or lost lots of profits and incomes. There was a huge need to fund healthcare, to support the economy through the crisis. And yet at the same time, tax revenues were tanking and the deficit was widening. And in fact, this past year, we've had 3 budgets instead of the usual 2. And certainly last year, it was looking very bleak. By February, the tax shortfall and the growth achievement outcome were looking somewhat less bleak, but still the worst in, I think the Reserve Bank has pointed out, the worst since really the 1920s, in fact, since the Spanish flu. So we have a budget which was already in crisis, overlain by the COVID crisis, questions about the way forward. The finance minister in February in Parliament tabling a budget which demanded very large spending cuts to get us back into balance, to make our finances more affordable. These are the people who oversee that process, who have to make those calculations and who have to make the numbers work. So let me introduce them. I've already made mention of the DG, Dondo Mogajane, who has, I think, so many degrees from the University of Durban-Westville, from Wits Business School, from the Kennedy School in Boston, that I'm not going to try and give them in too much detail. He has the task of leading the Treasury, where he's been for some time. Edgar Sishi, who is the Deputy Director-General in charge of the Budget Office, who has a MSc in economics from the School of African and Oriental Studies at the University of London. He's the person who has to make the numbers work out what we can indeed afford. Tshepiso Moahloli, who's the head of the DDG in charge of Asset and Liability Management, which, as my colleague in the Sunday Times pointed out, took 15 minutes to explain exactly what she did. But she's the person who oversees the borrowing and the bond market and looks after the cash. And Tshepiso has a master's in economics from Wits University. And last but absolutely not least, Mampho Modise, the Deputy Director-General in charge of public finances, who has a PhD in economics from the University of Pretoria. she's the person with the really unenviable task of negotiating with all the other government departments about how much is going to be spent and on what. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us. And let me start with you, DG. Could you give us a sort of a brief rundown on how the budget process actually works? What goes into it? What are the kinds of decisions that have to be made? And why was this recent February budget so tough?
Thanks, Hilary, and thank you very much to those who are participating in this webinar. The budget process is a very inclusive process and complicated in some ways, especially in the context where there's not enough resources to distribute. I'm saying it's inclusive in that we take into account what provinces want and aspire for, what municipalities want and aspire for, and it also takes cues from what the political party in power exactly is looking for and dictates in terms of being the government of the day. In this particular instance, the ANC government. Now, when you look at all of these interests that are there, because you have to address what municipalities want, what provinces want, including national departments, overlaying all of these, Hilary, will be political structures that inform the budget process, and there will be also technical structures that inform the budget. What do I mean by that? Technical structures mean committees that are made of in departments and technical officials in the departments. In government, there's budget forum where the budget forum, there's budget, the forum, which is a political structure, and the budget council, which is also a political structure. These two institutions are as a result of the Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations Act of 1997. This establishes this. MECs for Finance, together with the Minister of Finance, and MECs for Finance, with the Minister and COGTA and organized local government, including the Minister of COGTA, will make up the budget forum. So they oversee the distribution of equitable resources to provinces and municipalities. Technically, you then have a committee called the Technical Committee on Finance, made up of 9 MECs, 9 heads of treasuries, including ourselves as National Treasury, whereby issues of intergovernmental financing are engaged with. Supporting that structure are various committees, functional groups within national departments that informs various sectors in government, whether you're looking at the social services sector, the general public services sector, the economic services sector, and government departments will be clustered like that. Now, all of these, technical processes, make input to essentially what is the medium-term expenditure committee that I chair, made up of the DG in the presidency, the DG in COGTA, the DG DPSA, and the support of DDGs, DDG Mampho Modise and his 6 chief directors, who all in all then will make decisions insofar as recommendations, so far as priorities of government are concerned and allocation of resources. Now, all of those make recommendations to the Ministers' Committee on the Budget, which is a political committee chaired by the Minister of Finance, and it's a subcommittee of cabinet. That committee then make recommendations to the extended cabinet, including cabinet, and final decision is made. Now, all of these processes, and they're complex, they take place over anything between July and December, February, January of every year. The schedules are clear in terms of the timelines, in terms of the dates, etc. And all of that, by the way, we issue guidelines. And this year we are a bit late because we issued guidelines only around August. Normally we'd issue them in June, May, June of every year. In these guidelines, departments are then given guidelines to work around in putting budgets together, key dates that they must submit things by, so that we are able to put those red documents, those that we present on budget day, those thick documents. It's a process getting there. This budget that we are talking about.
DG, you've outlined a process which is a very collective process with political buy-in from the whole of government, rather than just a treasury process. Tell us, what was it that made this budget process such a tough one?
It was a tough one because the revenue estimates, we undershoot in terms of revenue collection. That was a big challenge. 300 billion that we came into this budget process, we had that shortfall. The demands as a result of COVID The economy was not performing, so you have many demands, whether it's health, the vaccine program, for instance, we had to commit late. After decisions have been made, we had to commit late, look for money. The other complication was the extension of the 350 rents. It's small because individual South Africans look at it, it's only 350. But it's costing us about 2.1, 2.2 billion a month in extending that, just that grant on its own. So we had to look for another 6.6 billion or so. So revenue is not increasing. Revenue has declined. The demand's increasing. Then what does that mean? And Tshepiso will talk about it later on, the debt, what debt does to the debt. Because on one hand, if revenue is not coming through, you are then forced to borrow more in order to address some of the services, and the economy is not growing. Challenges that actually have to make sure that the economy is boosted one way or the other. So that was another pillar that we had to address in this budget, saying over and above just the demands on the expenditure side, the revenue side is declining, but the economy, the levers that are there available for us in igniting the economy are not moving at the speed that we want to. And that's why in this budget, we then started talking about Operation Vulindlela and how important it is that it has to open the way. So Minister of Finance and the Presidents agreed that we'll set up the structure that Sean Phillips had, that will unlock, that will actually knock on areas, various departments to ensure that they do what they have to do and with the speed that is required. And so far, we have seen some benefits of that intervention. And I think we are on the right track.
I want to come back to that question of the economic growth challenge and what you're doing about getting structural reforms going. But in the meantime, could I come to you, DDG Edgar Sishi? This budget pencils in very large spending cuts in real terms, really. And of those spending cuts over the next 3 years, a very large proportion comes from putting the lid on the public sector wage bill. And that would mean a freeze for public servants in the upcoming wage negotiations. In other words, a 0% wage increase. Now, could you sort of share with us why is it so important to get that public wage bill under control? And what happens if those negotiations don't yield the outcome that you've catered for in the budget?
Thanks. Thank you very much, Hilary, for that question. I think on the wages, very briefly, there's a couple of things, a couple of points that we've made clear on public sector wages. One is that in the broader context of our fiscal strategy, we do need to shift the composition of spending, the emphasis of spending from consumption towards investment. And this is particularly important in the context of investing in an economic recovery as announced by the president. You do need to make sure that your orientation in the budget is towards those things that support investment, such as infrastructure and so forth. So that's one point. The second point is that if you look at the wage bill budget, the compensation of public sector employees in this budget, it grows by about 1.5% over the MTF. So there is some growth in there. And part of this is because we do have things in our wage system in South Africa that provide a fairly generous automatic progression for public servants. And over the years, public servants, especially over the last decade and a half, have received very significant pay increases, resulting in the cost of the wage bill in South Africa being among some of the most generous in the world. We illustrate this in Chapter 3 of the budget review. So I think often when people talk about the budget in respect of the wage bill, the context of it is sometimes lost, which is that you have a wage bill that's actually been growing very, very fast for a number of years. And also the fact that built into the budget are certain progressions. And the last thing I just want to say is that it's also important to remember that there is a context to where we're operating. We are still in the middle of an economic crisis that broke out a year ago due to the COVID pandemic. As you said in your opening remarks, people have lost jobs. People have lost incomes. A number of people have had to negotiate pay cuts with their employers and so on and so forth. This has not happened in the public sector. Government has protected the wages and the employment of public sector, public servants, which is what we want to do. But it's important that when we talk about it, we understand those contexts as well. And the fact that as we go into the negotiations, and they've already started, those are some of the issues that we are putting to our partners, that we have protected the wage bill. The wage bill is substantial, has grown substantially over the years, but it's important for us to control its growth so that it doesn't crowd out what we need to do as a country to promote economic recovery.
Briefly, Edgar, can you provide us any sort of update on what's happening in those public sector wage negotiations? I know some of the unions have been threatening battle, and can you just share with us how it's going, what it's looking like?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's more in the ambit of the Department of Public Service and Administration. They provide the lead in that regard. And of course, it's a negotiation, which means that, the nature of a negotiation is that it's a backwards and forwards, and there's a lot of things that come in and go out and so on and so forth. So obviously you would understand that, we wouldn't want to say anything that would contaminate those discussions. But I think that, we've been trying since last year. Our approach has been, since the 2020 budget actually, to do everything through the PSCBC. We respect the PSCBC, and we want the PSCBC process to work. And that's been led by the Department of Public Service and Administration. And all I can say to you is wait and see.
Thanks, Edgar. Can I come to you, Tshepiso? Lots of people might say, why can't we just keep running up the public debt in South Africa? Other countries have run up the public debt during the COVID crisis to the most eye-watering levels. Even the IMF is saying, to countries, don't withdraw the sort of stimulus too soon. So why can't South Africa do the same?
Thanks, Hilary. I think Edgar mentioned an important word, context. The same IMF that is saying, you should not withdraw stimulus quickly. Just recently, on the back of the spring meetings, the managing director of the IMF was saying that we should prepare for an emerging market crisis, debt crisis on the back of the pandemic. So I think while it is well understood that you need to provide some level of support to the economy during this period, it is equally important to understand that countries are not the same. I mean, even today, if you look at South Africans and you say all of you have troubles with your income, go borrow money. Others would be in a better position than others. Circumstances would be different. And I think that should be taken in that context, that while we are spending, there is also debt that already countries have accumulated, and they have not had the time to create the space so that when another shock comes, they are able to respond. So debt is not an issue. And I think most people think that we are anti-debt. Debt is not a problem. Debt is good. It needs to be used for productive means so that you are able to repay later on. So South Africa's challenge is that we are in a position where we are not able to generate enough revenue to pay for our expenditure that is non-interest, and also to pay for interest and get debt-related capital expenditure. As I speak to you right now, every year we borrow, not just to only finance the budget deficit, but we also borrow to pay for our debt. So in any language, any form, that is not sustainable. So I'm taking money from Edgar, I'm paying Hilary. When Hilary's time comes, I go to Dondo, I get Dondo to give him money, and I pay Edgar. So in anyone's mind, despite what the IMF says, that cannot be sustainable, because you are in a cycle, in a vicious cycle, where you are not generating enough money to deal with your obligations. So that is why, Hilary, we are cautioning at all times that our debt levels are not sustainable. It's not because we want to deny South Africans a good life, a supportive life, a kind of life where they can have their heart desires. It's because we can see the risk on a day-to-day basis of relying on the market to keep honoring our obligations.
In other words, borrowing just to pay the interest on the debt. So you get into a sort of a debt trap, as it were, Tshepiso. And I seem to remember from the budget that we are now spending something like 20 cents of every rand we raise in tax revenue just on servicing the debt. Would that be correct? Is it, and why is it so expensive, our debt?
I mean, our debt is expensive for many reasons. One is the credit quality of the country. So the credit ratings that we normally talk about, that other parts of maybe our society might not appreciate, is the fact that once a credit rating is allocated to you, it determines how much of a risk you are, in a way that when an investor then invests or buys your securities, they're able to then apportion the right risk premium to your debt. So that contributes to whether it's a good quality debt or bad quality debt. And where we are right now, where all the rating agencies rate us below sub-investment grade, it means our debt is not considered good quality debt. So the pricing of that debt will reflect that, one. Two, the supply or the quantum of debt that we put in the market every year also contribute towards the cost of our debt. And that's why you would see that when we issue these instruments, we have to issue more debt sometimes to arrive at the same level of funding that we require to fund government commitments. Others market related could be, depending on how the market moves, it could be factors that are external. For example, you've seen the past few weeks where there was quite a big volatility as a result of expectation of rates in the US going up. So investors then could potentially be transferring their money and buying securities there, and that then had a negative implication for South African debt. So it's factors that are specific to South Africa that are negative, that contribute to the cost of debt, and also factors that are outside of South Africa's control, as I've just outlined. So all that would contribute to how much we pay in terms of our debt. But the biggest contributor of all, honestly speaking, is the level of debt at any given point in time.
What are we heading up to 5 trillion rand over the medium term? It's quite an eye-watering number, no?
Look, it is quite a substantial amount of debt that we have to deal with, and that requires a certain amount of diligence when we deal with this debt. You're absolutely right. I mean, we are reaching about over 5 trillion over the period. It's about 87% of debt to GDP as a percentage, and in terms of the gross debt. So it's quite substantial. And one might say, but countries like Japan are running 200% of debt to GDP. Again, context. You can leverage up to a point where you are able to then honor your obligations. When you are not able to honor your obligations, it does not make sense to look at these big figures and say, but South Africa is only at 80%. Why not 100%? Why not 200%? So those would be the consideration that we look at. But where we sit, we're saying that the situation currently, where revenue continuously underperforms, expenditure is continuously under pressure. The balancing number, which is debt, cannot continue to increase, without having consideration of how you're going to pay it back. And one can argue, look, countries increase that. We have done the same. South Africa responded significantly. I mean, in any given year, Hilary, we're borrowing about 300 to 400 billion rands. In the wake of the pandemic, we increased the entire borrowing requirements to over 700 billion rands. I mean, that is significant in such a very short period of time. And we're able to, still access the market. We had to explore different sources of funding because we realized that that amount could have a very negative impact on the local market, given the amount, a big amount that is required within a short period of time. So we had to go out, and we can talk about that during the course of our discussion of how we went and sourced funds from international finance institutions, institutions like your IMF, New Development Bank, in order to meet our requirements and ensure that South Africans are not negatively impacted in terms of services by the pandemic, and over and above that, as Edgar indicated, still provide the support in terms of other grants at the time. Thanks.
You are muted, Hilary.
Yes, Mampho Modise, my apologies. I wanted to come to the question that must be absolutely on top of everybody's minds, which is the vaccine rollout. And I wanted to ask you, why was it that there was sort of uncertainty about whether government could afford the vaccine, and then, the private sector was brought in to pay for it? How much have you now allocated? Is that going to be enough? Where are we with the vaccine rollout? And why does the private sector need to pay part of the costs?
Thanks, Hilary. So I think the first issue is that for government, it has never been an issue of funding when we're looking at the vaccine rollout. It's always been the issue of, can we get the vaccines, the quality of the vaccines, when are these vaccines going to be available? I mean, the Minister of Health has been issuing statements and has been on the press trying to explain this. So basically, when we started at the time of the budget, we made an estimate of what the vaccines were going to cost us based at that time on the delivery dates. Now, when we got to the budget, we realized that Pfizer can give us some of these vaccines earlier, and there were other manufacturers that could give us earlier. Therefore, we did a special appropriation for about 1.25 billion, and that was given to the Department of Health to procure these vaccines in the previous financial year, which is 2020-21. Now, we work with health on a daily basis to come up with estimates of how much they're going to need. So what we have allocated in this financial year is 5.2 billion. But as you would have noticed in the budget, we increased the contingency reserve to 12 billion. And this is mainly because of the uncertainty around the vaccine program. As you know, the Minister of Health did indicate that it might take 2 years to do this. So we also allocated about 3 billion in the following fiscal year. What we also did, Hilary, is to allocate about 8 billion in this year to deal with the possible third and fourth waves. So for provinces and the National Department of Health, we allocated additional funding just to deal with the potential waves. I don't think it was a conversation of bringing the private sector to assist because government is unable to fund, but it was more of, if the private sector is willing to assist in this rollout, why would us as government say, don't assist? So it's mainly if the private sector is willing and comes forward to try and assist, definitely, but we have made it very clear between National Treasury, the Department of Health and the Presidency that this is a free vaccination program and it is available to everyone who is in South Africa. So there's no discrimination against that. But if the medical aids are saying they can afford to give 7 million, I mean, of course, as government, we will definitely welcome such contributions. Thank you.
Before I move on, I actually just wanted to ask, I remember earlier in the year, an estimate of 20 billion or 23 billion was provided for the from, I think, the Treasury for the total cost of the vaccine program. Mampho, do you have an up-to-date number on what the program might cost? Have you upped it or decreased it from that initial estimate at all?
No, we're still leaving those estimates as they are. And the reason we're doing that, as you could have seen, we're still at the testing stages for different vaccines. So we're still not sure at the end what combinations of vaccines we're going to have. Are we going to have fully J&J? Are we going to have Pfizer? Are we going to have AstraZeneca? So we're still not sure of what combinations we're going to have. So we're leaving the estimate at around 20 billion.
Mampho, I'm actually going to stay with you if I may, because we have a question that's come through on the chat actually from Abba Omar, which coincided with the question I wanted to ask, which is that the budget penciled in a cut in inflation adjusted terms to the social grants budget. And we have the 350 grant, which the DG mentioned, coming to the end of this month. And all of this at the time when those grants have been really quite important to cushion people from poverty and hunger. So my question is, on what basis did you make that decision to cut the social grants budget in real terms rather than cutting, say, other budgets? And if I could add to that, about Omar's question, which is, do you think there might be room in the medium-term budget in October to have another look at that and extend the social safety net?
Thanks, Hilary. So I think the best way to answer the question on social grant is to take on from what Tshepiso has alluded in terms of the debt. Basically, in simple terms, we can't afford more than inflationary increases in social grants. So Hilary, just a quick background. When we were faced with spending pressures, were going as early as when we started consolidating in 2012, when the previous president announced the fee-free education that required about 56 billion. In all of those, the social grants have always been protected. So we never really went into the budget of social grants to try and deal with the spending pressures. However, in this instance, there is no department that has not seen budget reductions. As you would have noticed in the media a couple of weeks ago, there were quite a lot of noise about the NSFAS transfers and whether students are going to be able to be registered. That is as a result of fiscal consolidation. So there is no department that could have been protected from these reductions. What we tried to do was not to reduce the social grants in nominal terms, because that would have been very difficult. But if you look at any other spending items that we have in the pot, there has been significant reductions. And Hilary, what is important is that if you look at the structure of our budget, social grants are the largest in terms of departmental allocations. So the moment you exclude social developments in these reductions, it means for the rest of the departments, the budget reductions will be significant. So the main thing is, one, we cannot afford more than inflationary increases. We did the best we could to try and maintain the nominal numbers and to have some minimal relief, but it is not sustainable. And if we continue to protect the social grants, it means other services will be impacted. Services such as providing water will be impacted. Basic educations will be impacted. They already are impacted, but at least we're trying to balance and make sure that we minimize the impact on service delivery as much as we could. In terms of the 350, SDG said, of course, it's coming to an end. However, if the fiscal position remains as is, and there is no uptake in growth, and we still have to deal with the rising debt, there's no room that we can see where we can say social developments should be, or these grants should be increased significantly from what we're proposing in the budget review. And I think what we try to do, Hilary, is to make sure that we protect the safety net of the people, but it doesn't make sense to move all the funding to social grants and then you still have to deal with water and sanitation, or you make that part of the budget even worse. So balancing which spending and which priorities played a big role when we were deciding on these budget reductions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mampho. And actually, I'm going to pick up with you, Edgar, because another part of that question related to the revenue. And I wanted to ask you, as the DG mentioned, we did have this enormous revenue overrun last year, well over 300 billion when you reported in October. But by February, the economy wasn't looking as terrible and the revenue was looking a little bit better. And even on the 1st of April, when the South African Revenue Service did its traditional end of the fiscal year update, It turned out they'd collected 38 billion rand more than had even been expected back in February, thanks to very good metals and mining prices and so on. So my question to you, DDG, is what is the strategy for the revenue, if you like, savings, for the less bad revenue outcome? You will have budgeted based on a very large revenue shortfall for this past year and going into this coming year. How possible is it that even in the next year or two, the revenue will come out better than you've budgeted for? And if that's the case, what will you do with those savings? Will you spend more? Will you cut the debt? What is your strategy?
Well, Hilary, these are not savings. This is a shortfall that's less severe than what was thought in October, but much more severe than what we thought either in February 2020 and more severe than at the time when the lockdown was initially announced. You'll recall that in April, we released a paper in which we conceptualized initially the idea of the supplementary budget that ultimately was tabled in June. In that document that we released in April, we said that the revenue shortfall had significantly expanded to the princely sum of 130 billion rands. Now, the revenue shortfall that's come out at the end is 175 billion rands. So I think there's a perception issue when you go from one situation to another situation. A sense of perspective needs to be restored to where we are. Of course, the result of having a less than severe revenue shortfall compared to, say, October, or for that matter, February, is not that you've got more money. The result of it is that you have less to borrow. So the massive amount of borrowing that you were planning to do that you did not want to do, you have to now borrow just a little bit less than what you initially thought you were going to borrow. And this is where it comes back to the issue of growth and economic performance. At the end of the day, Hilary, the primary issue here is we need an economy that is growing. And you need, as a fiscal authority in any country around the world, to have confidence that you can extract the resources from the economy to the level necessary for you to service your debt obligations, which Tshepiso was talking about. In other words, to the extent that you consider that the economic growth is sustainable and strong, that is the critical consideration in terms of what you're going to do on the spending side. I mean, with respect to the revenue itself, I do think that we've come out of a period, we're still in the tail end of that, but we came out of a period during last year of extraordinary volatility, probably once in two generation economic crisis that we had to manage. And the consequence of that was that our projections for where revenue was going to be were also subject to volatility. You saw how the numbers changed from February to April to June to October, just massive changes in the numbers. And we consider that going forward, we need to restore regular order. And in that regard, we need to avoid making the mistakes that were made in the period prior to the financial crisis in 2008. Remember what happened in that period. Prior to 2008, around about 2006, 2007, particularly 2007, there was a big bump in revenue as a result of an improvement in South Africa's terms of trade, the commodity super cycle, the price of gold and other commodities that South Africa produces rose, and it turned out to be a temporary increase in that. But in response to that increase in revenue because of the commodity super cycle, what did we do? We increased spending, and we particularly increased spending in the permanent areas of spending, particularly the wage bill. And we were caught with our pants down, so to speak, a few years later, where it turned out that revenue was actually temporary, that it actually started coming down, and you have committed yourself to spending on a permanent basis that was not covered by the resources that you can extract from the economy on a sustainable basis. So we're taking a long-term view of fiscal policy. We're asking ourselves questions such as, because remember, as everybody on this call would know, government doesn't have money. Government only has the money that it can extract from economic activity through taxes. And so if you think that way, you have to think about the sustainability of the revenue and therefore the sustainability of the economic recovery. And to the extent that we consider what that means over the long term, that is what informs our decisions about spending. We are committed to not repeating the mistakes of the past and making sure that whatever decisions we make on the spending side are, first of all, based on an understanding of how sustainable the growth is, and B, an understanding that we need to make sure that that spending, including spending that comes from debt, is directed towards areas that promote economic growth, not just consumption.
DG Mogajane, that leads us straight into the question I wanted to ask you about economic growth. I mean, how much of our budget problem is a growth problem? And what are you doing about boosting South Africa's economic growth? You've mentioned Operation Vulindlela, which is the joint initiative by the Treasury and the Presidency to try and get the structural reforms going that the government has long been promising to do. Where are the results of that?
Thanks, Hilary. We are on the right track, but let me just say once, for 30 seconds. There's a Tswana saying that says, "Bana ba motho," meaning siblings. "Bana ba motho ba kgaogana tlhogo ya tsie." Siblings share the head of a locust. It's a Tswana idiomatic expression that's there. Now, if you go back to Mampho's answer and response to the social grants and to the whole challenge of South Africa and what we're funding, we only, the head of a locust can only be this much. And if we are siblings like we are, whether you look at vulnerable groups or the South Africans, let's share the little that we have in the time of, when we don't have. But in the time of plenty, we have proven in the past that we are able to expand services, we're able to give a little bit more, and we saw that, and we have proven ourselves in the past when the years of plenty were there, and we're able to really, really support the vulnerable. So I thought I might just add a little bit more on that. Operation Vulindlela, as I said, is a joint initiative between Treasury and the Presidency, and was established by the Minister of Finance and Cabinet at the time. And ministers, departments, entities are held accountable in reforming and implementing the structural reforms that we've identified. You'll remember that in this document that we've issued, towards an economic, growth for South Africa, at the time, these were thoughts that we had put together. We shared our thoughts in the ANC circles. You'll remember when that morning, when I dragged Tshepiso and others to that ANC meeting, and then we discussed, we wanted to sell an idea, and we're happy that today when you talk about the Economic Reconstruction Recovery Plan, the ERRP, the fundamental aspects of what we're saying in that paper are included in there. And those are the things that today Operation Vulindlela is tracking, whether we're adding electricity generation, because we've noted that electricity generation is part, whether we are freeing high value broad spectrum for commercial use, and I think that must still happen. We know the challenges that the litigation that the sector has put up, in particular Eskom, but it's important that ICASA and the Department of Communication unlocks this, and Operation Vulindlela is on this. We said facilitating tourism and the e-visa system must be put in place. All that is in place. The e-visa platform is up and running. We've seen it. We've demonstrated that. We have seen interventions on the tourism side, whether the fund that the minister was talking about and just the general support, that this initiative is beginning to show some interest. We are facilitating skilled immigration, which is something that we've identified. And Vulindlela is also looking at this area. Home Affairs is faced with this thing in terms of what skills do we need? We don't seem to obviously think that there's an issue, it's a big issue, and we're doing that. Fixing and regulating freight and rail, including private participation in rail, etc., and cooperating airports, it's one of the big things that when you look at some of the aspects and the interventions that we are making now, I mean, the president's visit the other day to the port of Devon is not a coincidence. I think the interventions that President, go and see for yourself, so that when we speak about this thing in cabinet, you can actually see how long it takes for a container to be processed and what it means to unlock certain things. So I think when you look at some of these broad interventions, we are getting there. We're saying there was a long day yesterday of the Presidential Coordinating Committee and talking about water infrastructure in particular. So some of these things and that intervention where the DPWI department were actually taking, and a few metros were taking the president in confidence about things that are happening around, whether it's water reservoirs that are damaged, whether it's maintenance that needs to be done. Some of these things is not new things that must be done. But what Operation Vulindlela is doing is actually making sure that they go to each department and saying, where are you at on A, B, and C? What are you doing? And in that way, ministers are held accountable, DGs like myself are held accountable. And I think on that, and we know that the only way, and Edgar made this point, the only way that Tshepiso can borrow less, Edgar can have more to allocate, is when there's growth, is when clearly the tax revenues come our way, and we have to improve the efficiency of administering these taxes anyway. And that's where in this budget, we also gave almost R1 billion to SARS to say, sort yourself out and prepare yourself for when things turn around in terms of this economy, because COVID on its own make people to be more creative in terms of how they evade taxes. And I think SARS should be more than ready to actually do that. So we think growth is the answer to South Africa's challenges. Let's be serious. And that's the message that I'm sending to my colleagues in the various clusters GG's clusters that I attend. Colleagues, let's be serious about things that we have to do. Let's hold each other accountable, and let's have reasons as to why. If the reasons are political, let the politicians unlock the challenges. If the reasons are pure inefficiencies, let's kick some butt in the departments, officials, and make sure that things happen. So I think it's on us to ensure that all that we know we need to do, we begin to do. The IMF has said it many a time that South Africa's challenges are around unlocking structural reforms. They've been saying this for at least 10 years, if I remember. So I think it's only now in the last 18 months or so, Hilary, that finally I think we have become serious. You will remember in 2017, Treasury came with some interesting 14 confidence boosting measures, if you remember. When you look at those 14 confidence boosting measures, you go to that list. All of these things that we are doing now were there, but we didn't see commitment from line ministries to do that. So I think Vulindlela and the president and the way he's pushing us now, really delivery should be the order of the day. And that should translate into growth, that should translate into tax revenues, and Tshepiso headache will be less. 5 trillion is a lot of money. I mean, we can do it. We've done it before, early days, before 1997, 98. We did this. I mean, our debt to GDP was in the 26% or so. We brought it up from where it was to down to 26 or 27%. We can do that. Debt is good, as Tshepiso says, but we can bring it down so that we are able to unlock the potential that we have as government to support the vulnerable. We have that. Spending 300+ billion every year on debt service costs is unsustainable, and it's increasing. That money can be used. We are spending, just to put it in perspective, the total budget of health is less than what we're spending on debt service costs. How's that? Edgar can give you the exact figure. So it is unsustainable in any language. So the health budget, when you look at the total vis-a-vis what we're paying under debt, I mean, and we're talking billions here. So we can do better if we start to borrow less and borrow create cheaply, like we did. I mean, we went to international financial institutions, as Tshepiso said, it was a bit cheaper. So I think here there's more that we can do. There's more that I think we can do on the electricity front only, just by ESCOM and the whole program, IPP program that has been rolled out now, and the benefits should be seen. So there's more that we can do. We will stand firm in ensuring that we do what's right as our own contribution in the running and the management of the state as things are currently. Our role is very clear, which sometimes we boast about, in terms of what the Constitution says the Treasury should do and the Treasury should be able to do. Because everywhere you can imagine, I always say to my friends and colleagues in government, I say, guys, we are the only ones who don't go to you to ask for anything. All of you come to us as Treasury and ask for things. So we will remain steadfast in the management of public finances. We will remain resolute in the decisions that we have to do. And we will continue to make our contribution in the way that we continue to do it. And unashamedly so, and with no fear of favor, we'll continue to do what the Constitution, the PFMA, and the MFMA wants us to do as a Treasury on these areas that we're talking about today.
Anyone from the audience who'd like to ask a question, please to put it into the chat. We will pick it up and we will respond to you. Oh, I think I may be not seeing some of your questions, so give me one moment. What I'm going to do is, there's a good few questions now. I'm going to read some of them, and because we've got quite little time, I'm going to just read a couple of the questions and then give it back to the members of the panel to respond to the questions they think they would like to respond to and wrap up, because we are very, very unfortunately running out of time. I'm sure we could carry on the entire afternoon. A question from Manoj: why is the Chinese government involved in training the public sector to base our processes on the Chinese model of government? Surely we have homegrown ones. A question from Nelson: does the National Treasury have systems in place to monitor the spending of this budget? He also asks about the SMEs and the money that's been given to SMEs. And kind of, we were talking about tax here, DG. An interesting question: why is the progressive system of taxation applicable only to individuals? In other words, the richer you are, the higher the rate of tax you pay. While the business sector has a flat rate of 28%. Interesting one to answer. So those are some of the questions that have come through on the chat. And I think we've really just got 8 minutes left, unfortunately. So I'm going to give each of you just a couple of minutes. You're welcome to pick and choose the question you would like to answer. And could I start with you, Tshepiso? And I'm going to ask one last question because I'm quite surprised that nobody has asked it, which is, SAA has been saying in this last kind of couple of days, it's kind of getting ready to fly again. You've already given it more money. It's asked for even more money. Why is the Treasury not sort of putting its foot down on the subject of SAA? And if I could ask you to pick that up and make any closing comments that you would like to make. Tshepiso.
Thanks a lot, Hilary. Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting that there's an understanding of the Treasury that makes decisions outside of government. Treasury is part of government, and I think the outline of processes that DG Dondo started with at the beginning of the call are quite important. So we would make recommendations to decision makers in terms of how we see the budget, what are the constraints, and a decision was made to continue to fund SAA. Minister Gordon has come out to say the 10.5 billion that has been provided, would be the last. I don't know about that. And the important part was that from a Treasury perspective, we indicated the pressures, the fact that we do need to consolidate, and any spending that would be done, given the priorities of government, needs to be within that construct. And I think as the Treasury that is, given the stewardship of the budget by the Constitution, by the PFMA, that is our role, what the government decide to spend the money at, I think it is in their jurisdiction to do that. And government decided to reprioritize and grant SAA 10.5 billion. So I don't think it's a Treasury's call to put down their feet or not. I think we can do that in terms of the structure of the budget and the sustainability of the budget. But once a decision is made to fund SAA as opposed to something else, I think that is up to the decision makers who we provide guidance to. So yeah, thank you very much for the dialogue. I think it's important to know that government's only means of revenue is taxes. Debt is not considered as such. It is used to leverage, and to the extent that we use it wisely and we direct money to productive sectors of the economy, we can then benefit from this debt. But if we're just using it for consumption, once off consumption, it might lift the GDP in terms of the numbers, but in terms of productiveness and sustained productiveness, we see that that has not been the case. We've been increasing funding over years. I mean, other people would come and give us and promises of money. At this point, I would say no thanks to that. May I have grants at this point if they're possible? We would accept them in the Treasury and continue to fund. But I haven't seen those freebies yet. I'm still waiting for the freebies. But as it stands, very difficult balancing act that we need to strike at all times. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tshepiso. And Mampho, if I could come to you, I mean, some people have described this as an austerity budget. Certainly it's got, you're planning for spending cuts, which are fairly unprecedented. Are you worried about just to wrap up our conversation, are you worried about the consequences for service delivery and the social consequences in the longer term?
Certainly one has to be worried, Hilary. As a person who is in public finance, you would want to increase spending. You would want, as much as you're trying to improve efficiency, you would want to see more spent on social services. So of course we worried. I mean, when we presented the budget, we clearly stated what these consequences are. However, what we had to weigh is, are these consequences now justifiable so that we can have our finances in a sustainable path and then have a future that is better. So you suffer now and you have a better future you have a better future. But if you don't consider those, then you are likely to be in a situation where it would have been better for you to do something now than to leave things as they are. So trying to balance that was important. But another thing, Hilary, that is giving me sleepless nights is the additional spending pressures that we keep on seeing. So for example, there's been a lot of talk about the basic income grant. Luckily, it still talks and that thing has been finalized. But before you even introduce something like this, you have to look at the concept, you have to look at the current grant system. Are you going to remove all the grants to replace them with this? How are you going to consolidate the grant systems? Affordability, how much is it going to be? Can we afford it as the state? The targeted population, are you going to, who is the target? And is SASSA and the Department of Social Development ready to implement something like this? So there's still a lot of talks about the concept of the basic income grant. However, this is still a cost pressure that we're going to see. You still have the NHI. So the pressure don't end just because you have a situation where you need to consolidate. In terms of public finances, you still have a lot of other spending pressures where you have to figure out how can you best deal with these spending pressures. Thanks, Hilary.
So much, Mampho. And Edgar, I'm going to give you kind of 1 minute to make some closing comments, if you would.
Yeah, very quickly. There was a thing about the taxes. Let me just quickly say that taxes, businesses and individuals are different. Direct taxation on an individual is at the front end. Direct taxation on a corporation is at the back end. In other words, the corporation has had expenses, has engaged in various businesses. I think that the progressivity of the tax system includes, for example, that in the primary sector, we do have royalties on turnover, particularly in mining. So that does exist. But remember that most companies reinvest their profits. So you need to be careful to disincentivize the reinvestment of profits by promoting a dissipation of resources through expenses in your tax system. And I think that that leads neatly into just a closing comment to say that we're committed, as the DG is saying, to a stable public finances. We understand that money doesn't grow on trees. The government extracts resources from economic activity, so you need economic activity. But you also need prudence in the management of your finances so that you don't disincentivize the creation of economic opportunities and wealth, because that's what ultimately raises people's welfare. That's what ultimately creates the opportunity and the capacity for people to better their lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, DDG. DG Dondo, I'm going to give you the last word, and you haven't got a lot of time. I have to say you really have the most articulate team of DDGs who can take really complicated concepts and explain them in, I think, a way that just about everybody can see where your thinking is. But if you can just give us sort of one last thought to close our session.
Thank you, Hilary. This is not it. There's 6 more of the colleagues, same qualities, same commitment, and then we are here for the long haul, and no one should doubt that government finances, our public finances remain still in good hands. We are here and we'll do what we have to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you all on the panel for joining us. It's been a real treat and a privilege to have you with us. And thank you to the audience. I hope you are leaving knowing more than you did when we started, and that has been useful. The Treasury has indicated that they are willing to take any more questions that you may not have had either the time or the confidence to ask. So the chat will be open for a little while after the session. Please do put your questions in the chat, or you can address them to me at the Sunday Times, and I will pass them along. Thank you so much for joining us, and please do join us again next time for the next round of the Sunday Times live dialogues. Thanks a lot. Stay safe.